I'll never forget the moment Richard Caldwell looked across his mahogany dining table, swirled his 30-year-old scotch, and called me street garbage in front of his entire family. Welcome to the Mental Grand, where we share stories of justice, dignity, and the power of patience. My name is Daniel Cross, and I'm about to tell you how one insult at a dinner party became the catalyst for the most calculated takedown of my entire career. What that arrogant man didn't know when those words left his mouth was that I wasn't just some random boyfriend his daughter brought home. I was the man who held the keys to everything he'd built over 40 years, and he was about to find out exactly what happens when you underestimate someone based on where they came from. Let me take you back 6 months before that dinner. I met Sarah Caldwell at a legal conference in downtown Chicago. She was brilliant, compassionate, and completely different from her family. We connected over a discussion about property rights and urban development, and within weeks, we were inseparable. Sarah warned me about her father early on. Richard Caldwell was old money, fourth-generation wealth, the kind of man who believed your worth was determined by your last name and your country club membership. He'd built his empire on commercial real estate, buying up properties across the Midwest, and he ran his company, Caldwell Holdings, like a personal kingdom. Sarah told me he'd driven away every serious boyfriend she'd ever had, not through charm or reason, but through humiliation and financial intimidation. She'd seen him destroy men's careers with a phone call, ruin business opportunities with a whisper in the right ear. But here's what Sarah didn't know about me. I grew up in South Memphis, raised by a single mother who cleaned offices at night so I could go to school during the day. I put myself through community college, then state university, then law school, working 3 jobs and sleeping 4 hours a night. I learned early that people like Richard Caldwell existed, people who thought their money made them gods, and I promised myself I'd never let anyone make me feel small because of where I started. By the time I met Sarah, I was a senior partner at Morrison & Associates, specializing in commercial property law and corporate restructuring. I'd made my name untangling complicated real estate deals and finding loopholes in contracts that other lawyers missed. I was good at my job, extremely good, and I'd built a reputation for being thorough, patient, and absolutely relentless when someone tried to play games with me. The first time I met Richard was at a charity event Sarah dragged me to. He looked at me the way you'd look at something stuck to your shoe. He asked what I did, and when I told him I was an attorney, he smirked and said, "Well, every family needs someone to handle the parking tickets." His wife, Patricia, laughed like he'd said something clever. Sarah's brother, Marcus, who worked for Caldwell Holdings despite having the business sense of a goldfish, just sneered at me from across the room. That night, driving home, Sarah apologized for her father's behavior. She said he was like that with everyone, that I shouldn't take it personally. But I did take it personally, because I'd spent my entire life watching men like Richard Caldwell treat people as disposable based on arbitrary measures of worth. I didn't say anything that night. I just smiled, kissed Sarah goodnight, and started doing what I do best. I started paying attention. Over the next few months, I learned everything about Caldwell Holdings, not because I was planning anything at first, but because when you're in a relationship with someone, you naturally become interested in their family's business. Sarah would vent about her father's decisions, about properties he was acquiring, about deals he was making. Marcus would brag at family gatherings about expansions and acquisitions, dropping names and numbers like he was trying to impress everyone in the room. Richard himself couldn't help but talk about his empire whenever I was around, though he always did it in a way that suggested I couldn't possibly understand the complexities of real wealth management. And that's when I realized they had no idea who they were messing with. Every time Richard dismissed me, every time Marcus talked down to me, they were giving me more information. They assumed I was just some blue-collar lawyer who got lucky, someone who didn't understand high-stakes real estate or corporate finance. They had no idea I'd spent the last 8 years of my career specializing in exactly those things. The dinner party happened on a Saturday in early October. Sarah had been nervous all week because Richard insisted on hosting what he called a family evaluation dinner. Apparently, this was something he did with all of Sarah's serious relationships, a formal dinner where he decided whether someone was worthy of continuing to date his daughter. The arrogance of it was stunning, but Sarah begged me to go, said she really thought we had a future together and she wanted her family's blessing. I agreed, not because I cared what Richard thought, but because I loved Sarah and I wanted to support her. I wore my best suit, brought an expensive bottle of wine, and showed up at the Caldwell estate in Lake Forest with every intention of being polite and respectful. The house was exactly what you'd expect, a massive colonial revival house with columns, a circular driveway, and enough square footage to house a small village. Dinner started civilly enough. Patricia asked about my work, though her tone suggested she was asking out of obligation rather than interest. Marcus mostly ignored me, focused on his phone and occasionally making comments about properties Caldwell Holdings was acquiring. Sarah tried to steer conversation toward neutral topics, like upcoming holidays and family trips. But Richard was watching me the entire time with this cold calculation in his eyes, like he was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came during the main course. We were eating some elaborate duck dish that probably cost more than my first car, and Richard suddenly set down his fork and looked directly at me. He said, "Daniel, Sarah tells me you grew up in Tennessee, Memphis, correct?" I nodded, said, "Yes, sir, South Memphis born and raised." And that's when his expression changed, when this cruel smile spread across his face. He leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, I've done business in Memphis. Rough area, very rough. The kind of place where people don't understand the value of building something that lasts, of creating generational wealth. They're focused on survival, on getting by, which I suppose makes sense given their circumstances." He paused, took a sip of his scotch, and then delivered the line that changed everything. He said, "Sarah has always had a bleeding heart for strays and people from difficult backgrounds. I suppose that's admirable in its own way, but there's a difference between charity work and bringing street garbage to the family table. You seem like a decent enough fellow, Daniel, but let's be honest about what this is. You're punching above your weight class here. My daughter deserves someone from her world, someone who understands what it means to carry a name that matters." What happened next changed everything. The table went completely silent. Patricia looked down at her plate, not defending me but not supporting her husband either. Marcus actually smiled, like he was enjoying watching his father humiliate someone. Sarah's face went pale, then red, and she started to say something, but Richard held up his hand to silence her. He wasn't done. He said, "I've looked into your background, Daniel. Single mother, community college, worked as a janitor to pay for school. Very inspiring, very American dream and all that. But here's what you need to understand. People like you can work their entire lives and never truly arrive in circles like ours. It's not personal, it's just reality. Sarah will realize this eventually, and when she does, I'd prefer you bow out gracefully rather than drag this out and make things difficult for everyone." I sat there for a long moment, watching Richard's satisfied expression, listening to the silence around the table. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to respond, to defend myself, to tell this arrogant man exactly what I thought of him and his generational wealth. But I didn't. Instead, I did something that clearly surprised everyone at that table. I smiled, took a drink of my water, and said very calmly, "Thank you for dinner, Mrs. Caldwell. The duck was excellent." Then I stood up, looked at Sarah, and said, "I'll wait for you outside whenever you're ready to leave." I didn't raise my voice, I didn't make a scene, I simply excused myself and walked out of that dining room with my head held high, because I'd learned a long time ago that the best revenge isn't served hot, it's served cold and calculated after you've done your homework and prepared your case like the attorney you are. Sarah came outside 20 minutes later, crying and apologizing and saying she couldn't believe her father had spoken to me that way. She said he'd told him off, told him he was a bigot and a snob, and that she was ashamed to be related to him. I held her while she cried, told her it wasn't her fault, and drove her back to her apartment. But inside, something had shifted. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused, because during dinner, Richard made a critical mistake. He told me he'd looked into my background, which meant he'd done surface-level research, the kind of research that tells you where someone went to school, but doesn't tell you what they're capable of. He didn't know about the Meridian case, where I'd helped restructure a failing commercial property portfolio and saved 200 jobs. He didn't know about the Hamilton deal, where I'd found a contract loophole that saved my client $17 million. and he definitely didn't know that for the past 2 months, completely by coincidence, my firm had been retained by Westlake Capital, a private equity group that was very interested in acquiring undervalued commercial properties in the Midwest. The following Monday, I had a meeting with Westlake Capital that had been scheduled weeks earlier. These were smart people, professional investors who knew the commercial real estate market inside and out. During our meeting, I casually mentioned that I had been looking at properties in the Chicago market and noticed some interesting opportunities. I didn't mention Caldwell Holdings by name, but I did mention specific addresses, specific properties that I knew were struggling with occupancy issues and upcoming loan obligations. I provided analysis, market comparisons, and suggested that there might be opportunities for a well-capitalized buyer to acquire these properties at below-market prices if they approached the owners at the right time, meaning when those loan obligations came due and the owners needed quick liquidity. Westlake was interested. Very interested. They asked me to provide more detailed analysis, which I did over the next 2 weeks, all completely within my professional responsibilities as their retained counsel. At the same time, I started reaching out to some of the smaller investors who held partnership positions in Caldwell properties. These weren't shady backroom deals. These were professional conversations between an attorney and property investors discussing their investments and whether they were satisfied with the returns they were seeing. I asked questions about management, about revenue sharing, about whether the partnership agreements they'd signed were being honored in full. And what I found through these completely legal and ethical conversations was that several of these investors were unhappy. Richard Caldwell had a reputation for being difficult to work with, for making decisions without consulting his partners, and for prioritizing his own interests over partnership obligations. 2 of the investors told me directly that they'd been considering exercising buyout clauses in their agreements, but hadn't because they didn't think they could find a buyer who could meet the terms quickly enough. That's when I made my move. I connected these unhappy investors with Westlake Capital, facilitating introductions and providing legal analysis of the buyout provisions. I made sure Westlake understood exactly what they'd need to do to acquire these partnership positions, what timelines they'd be working with, and what leverage those positions would give them over the properties in question. Within 3 weeks, Westlake Capital had quietly purchased partnership positions in 3 major Caldwell Holdings properties, including Caldwell Tower. They did it through subsidiary LLCs, quiet transactions that didn't immediately raise red flags, buying out investors who were happy to exit at fair market value. And because I'd read those partnership agreements very carefully, I knew exactly what came next. Those agreements had provisions requiring unanimous partner approval for major decisions, including refinancing, sale of the properties, and certain operational changes. Richard Caldwell no longer had unanimous control of his flagship properties. But I wasn't done. Remember those loan obligations I mentioned? I'd noticed that 3 of Caldwell Holdings' major loans were held by Lakeside Commercial Bank, a regional bank that had been aggressive in commercial lending but was now facing regulatory pressure to reduce risk in their portfolio. I had a former law school classmate who worked in their commercial loan division. Over coffee, completely casually, I mentioned that I'd been seeing some concerning trends in the Chicago commercial market, specifically regarding occupancy rates and revenue generation for certain properties. I didn't mention Caldwell by name. I didn't need to. My classmate was smart enough to go back and review his bank's portfolio, and when he did, he realized that several Caldwell Holdings properties were underperforming relative to the projections that had been used to justify the loans. That triggered a review process, which led to the bank sending formal notices to Caldwell Holdings requesting updated financial information and asset valuations, standard procedure when a lender has concerns about a borrower's ability to service debt. The pressure was building, and Richard Caldwell still had no idea it was coming from me. To him, I was just the street garbage his daughter was dating, someone he'd dismissed and forgotten about after that dinner. But I hadn't forgotten. Every insult, every dismissive look, every arrogant word was fuel for what I was building. And the beautiful thing about revenge done right is that it doesn't look like revenge at all. It looks like business, like market forces, like unfortunate circumstances. It looks like the natural consequences of decisions made by someone who thought they were too smart and too powerful to ever face accountability. November came, and with it came the complications I'd carefully orchestrated. Westlake Capital, now holding significant partnership positions in 3 Caldwell properties, including Caldwell Tower. They did it through subsidiary LLCs, quiet transactions that didn't immediately raise red flags, buying out investors who were happy to exit at fair market value. And because I'd read those partnership agreements very carefully, I knew exactly what came next. Those agreements had provisions requiring unanimous partner approval for major decisions, including refinancing, sale of the properties, and certain operational changes. Richard Caldwell no longer had unanimous control of his flagship properties. But I wasn't done. Remember those loan obligations I mentioned? I'd noticed that 3 of Caldwell Holdings' major loans were held by Lakeside Commercial Bank, a regional bank that had been aggressive in commercial lending but was now facing regulatory pressure to reduce risk in their portfolio. I had a former law school classmate who worked in their commercial loan division. Over coffee, completely casually, I mentioned that I'd been seeing some concerning trends in the Chicago commercial market, specifically regarding occupancy rates and revenue generation for certain properties. I didn't mention Caldwell by name. I didn't need to. My classmate was smart enough to go back and review his bank's portfolio, and when he did, he realized that several Caldwell Holdings properties were underperforming relative to the projections that had been used to justify the loans. That triggered a review process, which led to the bank sending formal notices to Caldwell Holdings requesting updated financial information and asset valuations, standard procedure when a lender has concerns about a borrower's ability to service debt. The pressure was building, and Richard Caldwell still had no idea it was coming from me. To him, I was just the street garbage his daughter was dating, someone he'd dismissed and forgotten about after that dinner. But I hadn't forgotten. Every insult, every dismissive look, every arrogant word was fuel for what I was building. And the beautiful thing about revenge done right is that it doesn't look like revenge at all. It looks like business, like market forces, like unfortunate circumstances. It looks like the natural consequences of decisions made by someone who thought they were too smart and too powerful to ever face accountability. November came, and with it came the complications I'd carefully orchestrated. Westlake Capital, now holding significant partnership positions in 3 Caldwell properties, including Caldwell Tower. They did it through subsidiary LLCs, quiet transactions that didn't immediately raise red flags, buying out investors who were happy to exit at fair market value. And because I'd read those partnership agreements very carefully, I knew exactly what came next. Those agreements had provisions requiring unanimous partner approval from major decisions, including refinancing, sale of the properties, and certain operational changes. Richard Caldwell no longer had unanimous control of his flagship properties. But I wasn't done. Remember those loan obligations I mentioned? I'd noticed that 3 of Caldwell Holdings' major loans were held by Lakeside Commercial Bank, a regional bank that had been aggressive in commercial lending but was now facing regulatory pressure to reduce risk in their portfolio. I had a former law school classmate who worked in their commercial loan division. Over coffee, completely casually, I mentioned that I'd been seeing some concerning trends in the Chicago commercial market, specifically regarding occupancy rates and revenue generation for certain properties. I didn't mention Caldwell by name. I didn't need to. My classmate was smart enough to go back and review his bank's portfolio, and when he did, he realized that several Caldwell Holdings properties were underperforming relative to the projections that had been used to justify the loans. That triggered a review process, which led to the bank sending formal notices to Caldwell Holdings requesting updated financial information and asset valuations, standard procedure when a lender has concerns about a borrower's ability to service debt. The pressure was building, and Richard Caldwell still had no idea it was coming from me. To him, I was just the street garbage his daughter was dating, someone he'd dismissed and forgotten about after that dinner. But I hadn't forgotten. Every insult, every dismissive look, every arrogant word was fuel for what I was building. And the beautiful thing about revenge done right is that it doesn't look like revenge at all. It looks like business, like market forces, like unfortunate circumstances. It looks like the natural consequences of decisions made by someone who thought they were too smart and too powerful to ever face accountability. November came, and with it came the complications I'd carefully orchestrated. Westlake Capital, now holding significant partnership positions in 3 Caldwell properties, including Caldwell Tower, they did it through subsidiary LLCs, quiet transactions that didn't immediately raise red flags, buying out investors who were happy to exit at fair market value. And because I'd read those partnership agreements very carefully, I knew exactly what came next. Those agreements had provisions requiring unanimous partner approval for major decisions, including refinancing, sale of the properties, and certain operational changes. Richard Caldwell no longer had unanimous control of his flagship properties. But I wasn't done. Remember those loan obligations I mentioned? I'd noticed that 3 of Caldwell Holdings' major loans were held by Lakeside Commercial Bank, a regional bank that had been aggressive in commercial lending but was now facing regulatory pressure to reduce risk in their portfolio. I had a former law school classmate who worked in their commercial loan division. Over coffee, completely casually, I mentioned that I'd been seeing some concerning trends in the Chicago commercial market, specifically regarding occupancy rates and revenue generation for certain properties. I didn't mention Caldwell by name. I didn't need to. My classmate was smart enough to go back and review his bank's portfolio, and when he did, he realized that several Caldwell Holdings properties were underperforming relative to the projections that had been used to justify the loans. That triggered a review process, which led to the bank sending formal notices to Caldwell Holdings requesting updated financial information and asset valuations, standard procedure when a lender has concerns about a borrower's ability to service debt. The pressure was building, and Richard Caldwell still had no idea it was coming from me. To him, I was just the street garbage his daughter was dating, someone he'd dismissed and forgotten about after that dinner. But I hadn't forgotten. Every insult, every dismissive look, every arrogant word was fuel for what I was building. And the beautiful thing about revenge done right is that it doesn't look like revenge at all. It looks like business, like market forces, like unfortunate circumstances. It looks like the natural consequences of decisions made by someone who thought they were too smart and too powerful to ever face accountability. November came, and with it came the complications I'd carefully orchestrated. Westlake Capital, now holding significant partnership positions in 3 Caldwell properties, began exercising their rights under the partnership agreements. They requested detailed financial audits. They questioned management decisions. They blocked a proposed refinancing that Richard needed to extend one of his major loans. At the same time, Lakeside Commercial Bank, concerned about their risk exposure, began tightening terms on Caldwell Holdings' existing loans and declined to extend 2 significant credit facilities that Richard had been counting on. And here's where Richard's arrogance truly caught up with him. A smarter man would have diversified his banking relationships, maintained strong partnerships, kept his investors happy. But Richard had spent years treating people as disposable, burning bridges, making enemies. When he needed support, when he needed someone to extend him credit or buy him time, he found that his reputation had finally caught up with him. Banks didn't want to take on the risk, investors didn't trust him, and the partners he still had were listening to other voices now, voices that suggested maybe it was time for new management, new direction. December was when everything came to a head. Caldwell Holdings was facing a liquidity crisis. They had loans coming due that they couldn't refinance, partnership disputes they couldn't resolve, and a reputation in the market that was making it impossible to raise capital on favorable terms. Richard tried everything. He reached out to other banks, other investors, even tried to negotiate with Westlake directly. But Westlake, guided by legal advice from yours truly, held firm. They wanted control, or they wanted out at premium price that Richard couldn't afford to pay. The entire situation was becoming public knowledge in Chicago real estate circles. People were talking about the Caldwell collapse, wondering how someone with so much wealth and power could find himself in such a desperate position so quickly. And that's when I realized they had no idea who they were messing with, because what I'd done wasn't illegal or even particularly unusual in the world of commercial real estate and corporate maneuvering. I'd simply connected interested buyers with willing sellers, provided competent legal analysis, and let market forces work exactly as they're supposed to work. The final piece fell into place 2 days before Christmas. Westlake Capital, after weeks of negotiation, made a formal offer to acquire majority control of Caldwell Holdings' 3 major properties. The offer was fair from a market perspective, but devastating from Richard's point of view. He'd built these properties, they carried his name, and now he was being forced to either accept a buyout that would leave him as a minority partner with no control, or face foreclosure and bankruptcy. He had 72 hours to decide. That's when Sarah called me, crying again, saying her father's business was falling apart and she didn't understand how everything had gone wrong so fast. She said Richard was stressed, that he'd aged 10 years in the last month, that he was finally showing some humility and fear. Part of me felt bad for Sarah. This wasn't her fault. But another part of me remembered that dinner, remembered the look in Richard's eyes when he'd called me street garbage, remembered the casual cruelty of someone who thought their money made them better than everyone else. I told Sarah I'd look into it, that maybe I could help. And that's when I made a call to Richard Caldwell directly. He sounded different on the phone, tired, less arrogant. I identified myself and said I'd heard through professional channels that Caldwell Holdings was facing some challenges and that I might be able to facilitate a solution. There was a long pause, and then Richard asked why he would possibly help me after how he treated me. I let the question hang in the air for a moment before I answered. I said, "Mr. Caldwell, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this because Sarah deserves better than watching her father's pride destroy everything he built. I'm doing this because despite how you treated me, I believe in solving problems professionally rather than letting them destroy families. And I'm doing this because I want you to understand something very clearly. The man you called street garbage, the man you assumed was too low class to sit at your table, that man just saved your empire." The meeting happened at my office 2 days later. Richard came alone, no lawyers, no Marcus, no entourage. He looked smaller somehow, less imposing. I laid out the situation for him clearly. I explained how Westlake had acquired the partnership positions, how the bank pressures had developed, how his options had narrowed. I didn't tell him I'd orchestrated it. I didn't need to. As I talked, I watched the realization dawn in his eyes. He was a smart man, smart enough to connect the dots, to understand that the timeline of his problems corresponded exactly with that dinner where he'd insulted me. Then I presented the solution. I'd negotiated with Westlake on Richard's behalf, using relationships I'd built and leverage I'd carefully developed. I'd convinced them to accept a modified deal where Richard would maintain operational control of his properties in exchange for giving up majority equity position and accepting new governance structures that would protect all partners' interests. It wasn't the empire he'd had, but it was survival. It was a chance to rebuild with dignity intact. Richard sat across from my desk for a long time after I finished explaining. Finally, he asked the question I'd been waiting for. He said, "Why? Why would you help me after what I did?" And this is what I told him, these exact words that I want you to remember because they're the heart of this entire story. I said, "Mr. Caldwell, you looked at me and saw street garbage because I grew up poor. You assumed that where I started defined where I'd end up. But what you didn't see is that people like me, people who had to fight for everything we achieved, we learn things that people born into wealth never learn. We learn patience, we learn strategy, we learn that real power isn't about making people feel small. It's about being so competent, so professional, so undeniably good at what you do that even your enemies have to respect you. I didn't destroy you, sir. I saved you, and I did it using the exact same skills and intelligence you assumed I didn't have because of my zip code." What happened next changed everything for both of us. Richard signed the agreements I'd negotiated, Caldwell Holdings survived, restructured but intact. The story in Chicago real estate circles became about smart restructuring rather than catastrophic failure, which protected Richard's reputation and his family's legacy. But the power dynamic had shifted permanently. Richard knew, everyone knew, that his empire had been saved by the man he called street garbage. Over the next few months, something unexpected happened. Richard started treating me with respect, genuine respect. He asked for my advice on business matters. He apologized to me privately for his comments at dinner, said he'd been arrogant and wrong. He even offered me a position as general counsel for Caldwell Holdings, which I politely declined because I preferred the independence of private practice. But I accepted his apology because Sarah deserved to have a father who could learn and grow, and because I'd proven my point without destroying anyone in the process. Sarah and I got engaged the following spring. Richard gave us our blessing, and during the engagement dinner, he stood up and made a toast. He said that he'd learned more about character and competence from me than from anyone in his business career, and that he was grateful his daughter had found someone with the strength and intelligence to stand up for himself without compromising his integrity. It was a far cry from street garbage, and everyone at that table understood the significance of his words. We got married in June, a beautiful ceremony at a venue Sarah had always dreamed of, and Richard walked his daughter down the aisle with tears in his eyes. At the reception, during the father-daughter dance, I watched them together, and I realized that my revenge had become something bigger than just proving a point. It had become about showing that dignity and competence matter more than birthright, that where you start doesn't determine where you finish, and that sometimes the best way to defeat someone's cruelty is to be so good at what you do that they have to recognize your worth. Marcus never really changed. He still works for Caldwell Holdings, though he reports to new managers now and has much less authority than he used to. He's cordial to me at family events, but keeps his distance, probably still stinging from watching his father's empire nearly collapse and be saved by someone he dismissed as being beneath him. Patricia has actually become a close friend of mine. She's confessed privately that she was ashamed of how she'd acted that night at dinner, that she'd stayed silent when she should have spoken up, and that she respected how I handled the entire situation with class and professionalism. The Caldwell family gatherings are different now, more genuine, less about posturing and more about actual family connection. And Richard, well, Richard has become something like a mentor to me in an unexpected way. We talk business regularly, and I found that beneath his arrogance was actually a sharp mind and decades of experience that, when shared without condescension, is genuinely valuable. But here's the most important part of this story, the reason I wanted to share it with all of you watching The Mental Grand today. Revenge isn't about destruction. Real revenge, meaningful revenge, is about proving wrong the people who underestimated you. It's about being so good at what you do, so professional, so undeniably good at what you do, that even your enemies have to respect you. Richard Caldwell thought he could dismiss me because of where I came from, because my mother cleaned offices and I worked as a janitor to pay for college. He thought those facts made me less than him, made me unworthy of his daughter and unworthy of respect. But what he didn't understand is that those experiences didn't make me less. They made me more. They made me hungry, strategic, patient, and absolutely determined to never let anyone make me feel small again. And when the moment came when I had the power to destroy him completely, I chose instead to save him, because that's what people with real character do. They don't kick others when they're down. They extend a hand. They solve problems, and they prove their point through excellence rather than cruelty. I still practice law. I'm still a senior partner at Morrison & Associates, still specializing in complex real estate and corporate matters. But now I also handle work for Caldwell Holdings occasionally. And every time I walk into that office, every time I see Richard's name on the door, I'm reminded that the best revenge isn't about taking what others have built. It's about being so undeniably competent that they have to recognize you as an equal, that they have to admit they were wrong about you. Sarah and I built a beautiful life together. We have a home in Lincoln Park, we travel, we're planning for kids in the near future. Her family is part of our life, genuinely part of it, in a way that would have seemed impossible that night at dinner when I was called street garbage. And every time I sit at the Caldwell family table now, every time Richard asked for my opinion or Marcus has to acknowledge my expertise, I'm reminded that dignity and competence are more powerful than any inherited wealth or family name. To everyone watching this who has ever been dismissed because of where they came from, who has ever been told they're not good enough because they don't have the right last name or the right connections, I want you to hear this clearly. Your beginning doesn't determine your ending. The struggles you face, the obstacles you overcome, they're not weakness, they're training. They're preparation for the moment when you'll face someone who thinks they're better than you, and you'll have the skills and the strength to prove them wrong, not through violence or cruelty, but through sheer, undeniable excellence. Richard Caldwell learned that lesson the hard way. He learned that the janitor's son he dismissed could outmaneuver him in the business world he thought he controlled. He learned that intelligence and competence matter more than birthright. And he learned that sometimes the people you underestimate are the exact people who'll save you when everything falls apart, because they have character you never developed. My mother called me after she heard the story from Sarah. She cried on the phone, not because I'd gotten revenge or proven someone wrong, but because she was proud that I'd done it without losing myself, without becoming cruel or vindictive. She said that she'd work those night shifts cleaning offices so that I could have opportunities she never had, and the greatest gift I could give her was to use those opportunities with integrity. That phone call meant more to me than any business success, more than watching Richard Caldwell acknowledge my worth, more than anything else in this entire story, because at the end of the day, this wasn't really about revenge. It was about honoring the sacrifices made by people like my mother, people who work hard and never get recognition, and showing that their children can rise to any level while maintaining the dignity and character they instilled. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that justice and dignity matter, if you've ever been underestimated and want to see more stories about people who overcome that with intelligence and class, then I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that like button, leave a comment telling me about a time you proved someone wrong, and subscribe to The Mental Grand, because we're building a community of people who understand that real strength isn't about putting others down. It's about lifting yourself up so high that even your enemies have to respect you. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that where they started doesn't determine where they'll finish, that being called street garbage by someone born into wealth says everything about them and nothing about you. This channel is about justice, dignity, and the power of patience and planning. It's about showing that you don't need to destroy your enemies when you can simply outclass them so completely that they have no choice but to acknowledge your worth. The lessons I learned from this experience have shaped everything I do now. I handle pro bono work for people from backgrounds like mine, people who face discrimination and underestimation because of their zip codes or their bank accounts. I've mentored a dozen young lawyers who came from difficult circumstances, helping them navigate a profession that still has too many Richard Caldwells, too many people who judge you by your last name rather than your competence. And every single one of those mentees, I tell them the same thing. Be so good at what you do that your enemies have to save face by pretending they always respected you. Be so professional that people forget where you came from because they're too busy being impressed by where you are. And most importantly, when you have the power to destroy someone who wronged you, consider instead what it would mean to save them, because that's the ultimate proof of character. Richard and I were having coffee last week, just a casual meeting to discuss a property deal that Caldwell Holdings and one of my clients were both interested in. Out of nowhere, he said something that I want to share with you. He said, "Daniel, that dinner was the biggest mistake I've made in my business career, not because of what almost happened to my company, but because I almost lost my daughter over my own arrogance. You could have destroyed me. You had every reason to, but you saved me instead. And in doing that, you taught me more about leadership and character than I learned in 40 years of business. That's not something a man forgets. That's not something a man can ever repay." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and changed the subject to the property deal. But later, driving home, I thought about his words and realized that this is what real victory looks like. It's not your enemy lying broken and destroyed. It's your enemy becoming your ally because you showed them a better way to be. So here's my final message to everyone watching. The next time someone dismisses you, the next time someone calls you street garbage or any other insult designed to make you feel less than, remember this story. Remember that the best revenge is patience, planning, and professional excellence. Remember that you don't need to destroy people to prove them wrong. You just need to be so undeniably good at what you do that they have to recognize your worth. Remember that dignity matters more than retaliation, that character matters more than cruelty, and remember that sometimes the greatest victory is turning your enemy into someone who respects you, who learns from you, who has to acknowledge that they were wrong about you from the very beginning. That's the kind of justice that lasts, the kind that changes people, the kind that makes the world a little bit better. Thank you for watching The Mental Grand. Hit that subscribe button, share this story, and remember that your past doesn't define your future.